This is the first lecture on slavery and the founding. In this lecture and in the subsequent ones, we're really approaching one big question, which is this. Um, After all this talk about the founders believing that everyone is created equal and endowed with equal natural rights to life, liberty, and property, we have to confront the massive living contradiction to that principle, which was under their eyes, the institution of slavery. Right? How do we understand the fact that many of the founders were slaveholders, that they proclaimed natural equality, but at the same time at least seemed to condone the institution of slavery? Why didn't the founders abolish slavery? Was it because they thought that slavery was in fact a just institution? Were they hypocrites? Right. And as you're reading, which is from Thomas West's book, Vindicating the Founders, shows the question is actually more complicated than that. And I'd mentioned, by the way, that I don't necessarily expect you to accept all of the assertions that West makes. I mean, he's definitely trying to prove a particular point. He's trying to show that the founders were justified. And, you don't necessarily have to agree with that. Sorry, I'm just adjusting the camera a little bit because I seem crooked. Um, but nonetheless, I find the West chapter really helpful because he lays out a lot of facts that oftentimes people are not aware of. So in the purpose of these lectures on slavery and the founding is to show that, in fact, there is not the kind of simple contradiction or hypocrisy that people oftentimes believe there is when they see the founders proclaiming equality, but nonetheless owning slaves. Now, in this lecture, when I refer to page numbers, by the way, I'm going to refer to the numbers in West's book, and this chapter begins on page 1 of his book. So I'm not going to be referring to packet page numbers. I'll be referring to page numbers from the West reading. And you can find the West reading. It's the very last thing in your packet. It begins after page 246. And so West, the way he frames the issue is he says there are really kind of three charges that you oftentimes find made against the founders. So there are three sets of charges that West seeks to confront. The first charge is the claim that the founders did not actually, in fact, believe that all human beings were created equal, that they actually did not believe that African Americans were men or men endowed with equal natural rights. So that's charge number one. Charge number two is that no, the founders believed that, but they didn't really realize the full implications of their views. So they believed or thought they believed in human equality, but at least at the time didn't realize that this implied the injustice of the institution of slavery. And the third charge, the most serious charge, is that the founders knew full well that the principle of natural equality was inconsistent with the practice of slavery, but that they knowingly betrayed their own principles. So they're hypocrites. As I said, West thinks it's more complicated, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So charge number one, all men are created equal, was not understood to apply to African Americans. Is this charge true? This one, it's pretty easy to show, is not accurate. It's false to claim that the founders did not consider African Americans to be human beings. Pretty much every major founder, at least, knew that African Americans were human beings. It's obvious. And believed that they were created equal. And a number of them even explicitly acknowledged the injustice of the institution of slavery because of this. And he gives quotations on pages 2 through 5. So, for example, Jefferson, in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, one of the charges against the king was precisely the introduction of the unjust institution of slavery in the American colonies. Now, obviously, nobody would put that in there unless they thought that slavery was unjust. And then there are other quotations as well that he provides. So that's just too simple of a charge to be true. But then that leads to the second charge, which is more serious or more formidable, which is that the founders really did believe that all human beings were created equal, but they didn't really recognize the full implications of these principles yet. They didn't kind of stop to apply it to the institution of slavery. But that's actually not true. Even there is evidence that where you can see that, in fact, within the generation of the founding, they already began to alter the way that the institution of slavery was treated in light of the recognition that it was unjust. So here you have to be thinking in terms of the logic of the revolution's justifying principles, that to justify revolution, you had more and more during the revolutionary period, more and more invocations of the right to natural liberty and natural equality. And you can see that in this context, that many founders applied this principle to condemn the institution of slavery. Even before the revolution, people like James Otis and John Jay did it. And even in the South, you began to see some recognition during the time of the revolution that the principle of natural equality was contrary to the institution of slavery. And there's even, for example, in 1774, there's a petition that some slaves brought forth, petitioning for their liberty, where they invoke the natural rights doctrine to show we are human beings endowed with equal natural rights, and therefore slavery is unjust. So you can see that the many people in the United States at the time of the founding were aware of the fact that the principle of natural equality condemns the institution of slavery. Now, one thing that's important to recognize here, and this is going to hold for a long time in American history, is that even though many of the founders recognized that slavery was unjust, it didn't mean they weren't racist. They were racist. And you can find plenty of evidence for this. You have some founders who maybe question that, but for the most part, it's simply true to say that the founders believed that whites were morally and intellectually superior to African Americans. There's just an abundant historical record. But the thing to keep in mind, and this sometimes this might seem like a subtle point, but you've got to keep it in mind, is that just because they were racists didn't mean that they could not believe in equal natural rights. They could believe that some groups of human beings were superior or inferior to other groups of human beings, and yet at the same time still believe that there are certain rights that every human being has simply by virtue of being a human being, right? Now, obviously, though, if you are a racist, even if you nominally believe in equal natural rights, you're going to be much less motivated to stand up for or to respect the rights of those that you believe are inferior to you. So I believe, and I think, Wes mentions this a little bit, but it's important to emphasize that racist opinions about African Americans is one of the things that made whites more willing to tolerate the institution of slavery, even when they might claim that they believed it was unjust. But Jefferson and other founders pointed out that the inferiority or superiority of individuals with respect to talents or virtues, whether you're talking about individuals or you're talking about racial groups, this has no bearing whatsoever on the question of whether or not human beings have unalienable rights. As Jefferson says in one place, Isaac Newton was far, far intellectually superior to me, but that doesn't mean that he has the right to enslave me, right? The fact that some people might be intellectually or morally superior doesn't mean that other people naturally become their slaves. So the racism of the founders does not directly translate into some kind of belief that only certain people have the right to be free. You can believe that everybody has the right to be free, but at the same time still have racist opinions. We'll see this in Abraham Lincoln too. But so really all of this just leads to the most fundamental question, which is, if, as I think it's pretty clear, the founders recognized that the institution of slavery was unjust, why didn't they abolish it? Because that's really the problem. You think, well, if they thought it was unjust, why didn't they get rid of it? And if they didn't get rid of it, doesn't that mean that in fact they thought it was okay? Again, it's a little bit more complicated. But one thing to mention here, and this is a very helpful part of West's chapter on pages 12 and 13, is that even though obviously slavery was not abolished in the founding era, you find evidence both in the North and in the South, various things that were done to try to limit the institution of slavery in various ways. So some actions were taken to limit or to abolish slavery. And starting, around 1774. So you find that, for example, the slave trade, the international slave trade, so not talking about like selling slaves, but importing slaves from Africa and from Caribbean colonies. The abolition of the slave trade was effectively in place by 1798. It was more or less done away with. In the northern states, around the time of the adoption of the Constitution, you had either immediate or gradual abolition of slavery, right? So quite quickly during the founding era, there were a number of states that did abolish slavery. Because you've got to remember, at the time of the Revolution, slavery existed in all the colonies. It was just the case that in most of the northern colonies, even though slavery existed, it was marginal. It was not economically important. So there were slaves, but there were not many of them. It was really in the South where you had a large number of slaves for economic reasons. So during the founding era, you do find the abolition of slavery in several northern states. But there were even changes made in the South. So, for example, in the South, in many places, manumission laws were made easier. Manumission, that's the legal term for the act of freeing a slave. And in the South, during the founding era, in many states, it was in fact made, legally speaking, it was made easier to free slaves than it had been prior to that. So that, for example, the number that he gives is by 1810 or so, there are about 108,000 free African Americans living in the South. So you have slaves freed in the South. You also had about 5,000 slaves that were freed during the Revolutionary War. Another big piece of evidence, or another thing for limiting slavery, was that in 1787, so still under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress of the United States passed the Northwest Ordinance. These were the Northwest territories that eventually become places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. So at that time, it was just one big territory. So Congress made laws to govern those territories until they became states. And the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, giving the law to that territory, banned slavery there. So they did not allow slavery to be introduced into those territories. There were southwestern territories, and their slavery was allowed because it had been the understanding that when the southern states ceded these lands, that these were claimed by southern states, when these territories were ceded to the federal government, it was on the understanding that slavery, which already existed there, the people who lived there, would continue to exist. Now, another interesting piece of evidence you find is that there are actually southern courts where you find judges making the assertion that the institution of slavery, although it is protected by human law, was in fact contrary to natural law or natural rights. So you even have southern judges who admit the injustice of slavery. And so I think West quite reasonably concludes on the basis of this timeline that prior to the revolution, there really wasn't much action taken to try to limit or to abolish slavery. The institution of slavery was, if not completely unproblematic, it was pretty much just the way things were, and there was very little done to alter it. So since there was little action to limit or to abolish slavery before the revolution, but we find much action after the revolution or during the revolution and after the revolution to limit and to abolish slavery, that would suggest that the reason why these actions were being taken was mainly because Americans were applying the logic of the revolutionary principles. Here we are invoking natural human equality Among other things, what this is going to require of us is getting rid of the institution of slavery. So you can see how these many actions that were taken to limit or to abolish it suggest that they are, in fact, clearly applying the principles of the revolution to the institution of slavery. But then this leads to the really big question, which will be the subject of the next lecture, of, well, why didn't they just abolish it when they adopted the Constitution? Why, in fact, does the Constitution protect slavery? So in the next lecture, we'll talk about the status of slavery in the Constitution.